Anyway, so I think one of the things that we really wanted to cover is there's a new law that's in place, right? About anytime that somebody owns an LLC, that there's some new disclosures or filings that have to happen. And I think one of the confusing parts is a lot of people are thinking, well, is this a rumor? Is this, or other people have said, is this something that's actually going to stick? Are they going to repeal it before the deadline hits? What is it? So I wanted to kind of talk to you a little bit about what this law is and how it affects people who own entities, LLCs, and things like that. But we have to register with the government. Is that what it is?
That's right. New entities that are created this year have 90 days to register with the Treasury Department. It's their subdivision called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The acronym is FinCEN. 90 days to register with FinCEN.
It's a friendly acronym. Sounds friendly when you FinCEN's coming.
Oh, it
right?
sounds so friendly. I would love to meet with this.
Exactly. So that's if they start at an LLC this year, they have 90 days.
That's right.
And if they have an existing entity from previous, then they have longer to register?
They have until December 31st of this year to register an entity that was formed before January 1st of this year.
So some of the confusion, I think, is around, okay, well, don't they know who we are anyway? Like, I mean, I own LLCs, right? And so, but don't they, if my name is on the LLC and that document is recorded somewhere, right? Don't they already know who owns the LLC? Why do we have to register this way?
Well, when you register with the state of Utah, you're not required to disclose who the owners are. But FinCEN is very interested for purposes of stopping money laundering, of knowing who the real owners are. And that's the purpose of this registration, is to disclose who the owners are.
So does that mean that if somebody was going after, kind of staying anonymous, right, and they had set up something that now is no longer anonymous as far as what the public can see, or is it only the government that can see this type of a registration?
It's just the government that can see this. The FinCEN database is not a public database. It's a database for government agencies that have a need to know who the owners of that company are.
Interesting. So right now, or at least previous to now, I should say, even the government themselves would have no idea who owned an LLC if the owners chose to structure it in such a way they couldn't even tell.
That's right. Right now, before this new law called the Corporate Transparency Act took effect at the beginning of the year, if the government looked on the state of Utah website, they wouldn't know who the owners of that LLC or corporation or entity, who the owners are.
What would happen if somebody had an entity where maybe they have an agent that does all of it for them? Because that's one of the things that sometimes people do, right? Like even attorneys, somebody could form an LLC and do everything for you, and you could retain your, I guess anonymity, something like that. How do you say that?
Anonymity.
Anonymity. That one. You could retain that if you had an agent that was interacting between you and all the registrations, but now that doesn't work anymore?
Well, on the state of Utah level, you can still have the anonymity, but for the FinCEN people, you will have to disclose who the owners are of that LLC or that entity.
Gotcha. So what would happen if the owner of my LLC is another LLC?
Then they go up the chain. So suppose we have an LLC owned by an LLC. They say, well, then their FinCEN wants to know, well, who are the owners of that parent LLC? And if you have them stacked 5 deep, they go up to the very top and say, well, we want to know who the owners are of that top LLC.
Is it only LLCs? Is it, what if I have a partnership, or what if I have a different type of corporate structure? Is it any type of corporate structure, or is it just LLCs?
It's any entity that has to be registered with the state of Utah. That would include LLCs, corporations, limited partnerships. It would exclude a sole proprietorship where you're just using a DBA. It's John Smith, DBA, Smith's Auto. That would not have to be registered.
Gotcha. And we're talking about Utah because that's where we're at, but this is a nationwide thing, right? So if somebody says, oh, I've got an LLC, but it's in Alaska, or something like that. Basically, anywhere that you have an LLC, it has to be taken care of.
Yes, this is national. It doesn't matter what state your LLC is in, it still has to be registered with FinCEN.
Gotcha. And what about trusts? There's obviously lots of different types of trusts, right? But it's often been said that trusts are more of a private document, not necessarily registered with the states. Should people be worried if they have a trust that owns assets?
The trust itself does not have to be registered. But if the trust owns, let's say, an LLC is owned by a trust, then the trustee of that trust will have to be disclosed as what they call a beneficial owner. They make a distinction between the people who actually own it, 25% or more of that entity, and the people who manage it. And they call the managing people the beneficial owners. So the trustee would be a quote-unquote beneficial owner, and that trustee would also have to be disclosed. And when we talk about disclose, it isn't just giving them your name, it's giving them your home address where you live and an image of either your driver's license or your passport. So it's a higher level of what we usually think of as disclosure, because that image of your driver's license, of your passport, is going to go into their database.
Interesting. What happens if someone moves? Does that mean that, let's say I register this year with one of my LLCs and I move, do I have to constantly update my filings with FinCEN?
You do. You have just 30 days to notify them that there's been a change.
30 days.
That's right.
That's pretty tight.
That's right.
Interesting. So what are the penalties? I mean, let's say somebody says, you know what, this is a new thing, it's really not that important. I mean, what could possibly happen if somebody doesn't do this?
Well, there's a civil penalty of $500 per day that you're in violation. And that can go on as long as you're in violation. There's also a criminal penalty of either $10,000 and or up to 2 years in jail.
Wow. So by judging by that, this isn't exactly jaywalking. They want you to take it seriously.
They do. This isn't just a minor thing. You have to really do it, because you could get in big trouble if you don't.
Gotcha. Is there any exemptions, like where somebody might be in a particular situation or a demographic or anything like that, where if you did own an LLC that you wouldn't have to register?
Yes, if you go to the FinCEN website, they have materials with a specific list of like 20 exemptions. And so you can check and see, like if you're a business that employs 20 or more people and that makes $5 million a year, then you're exempt. If you're a bank, or if you're a credit union, or if you're, anyway, I won't go through all the exemptions, but there's a list of these exemptions, so you'll want to check. But if you're just a little mom and pop LLC, you set it up just for your own personal use, it's highly unlikely that you're exempt.
Interesting. So if this was in place historically, and I don't know if we can include this, but if this was in place historically speaking, would the whole Hunter Biden debacle be easier for them to track how the money was going through those organizations?
Well, if this had been in place 10 years ago, then all those LLCs would have had to have registered with FinCEN.
Right. So when the money, I don't know too much about it, but, from the news, but as the money came in, they'd say, oh, okay, well, this was deposited from China into this LLC and was owned by these guys, and they can then understand, I guess, better how the money was flowing through and what they were doing with it.
I don't know the facts well enough as to how they've been tracking where the money goes, but just under this law, it would be easier for them to know, oh, here's the people who the actual owners are, because this is meant to make it so people just can't create shell corporations or shell LLCs. This is meant to make it so that can't happen anymore. The so-called shell game. They can't just create shells and have no one know who's behind those shells.
So when we take a look at kind of this whole thing that's going on, I guess, are there positives? Do you see any positives for LLC owners, or, we have to go through this process and give them our personal information, which again is kind of weird because I know that the federal government has copies of my ID everywhere, right? Like my passport, my driver's license, and all that kind of stuff. So to me, it kind of seems weird that like, oh, all of a sudden they need a copy because I know they've got lots of copies. But is there any positives that people can see out of this, or is it just more of a more oversight, more penalties, Big Brother kind of a thing?
I think for most people, they won't see a big positive. It's just another to-do thing they have to put on their to-do checklist, more oversight. Um, if there is a positive, it's that if you own an LLC that's a parent LLC and it owns a bunch of subsidiaries, the process of disclosing that will be pretty simple. Because once you've disclosed the parent, the subsidiaries, you can just give FinCEN an ID number for the parent. It'll save you that. Like if you had a parent LLC that owned 5 subsidiaries, once you've organized or disclosed the parent, you can just give that parent's ID for the other 5. So that saves you some time. So, but it's still more work for you. And it is a lot of work. I mean, it's estimated that the cost of doing this is in the millions of dollars for all the businesses across the country.
And when you say cost, is that just the time that it takes to do this, or is there actually other financial hard costs that?
It's a hard cost if you hire someone to help you do it, and if you do it yourself, it's your time.
Gotcha.
A lot of work.
So how long does it take? You've been through the process, right? As far as registering with FinCEN and all that kind of stuff. What should somebody expect as far as how much time it takes to disclose and register?
For a small LLC with a couple of owners, you should be able to register in about 30 minutes.
So not too bad.
Not too bad.
And then if you have multiple, then obviously it's just each one you have to go in and do this several different times and all that.
Right.
What does this cause any other complications other than just disclosing as far as estate planning, anything else? Or is it just a matter of, oh, we're just disclosing some information to the federal government, everything else stays the same?
I wouldn't change my planning because of this law. I guess if people want to keep things more private, they could restructure their businesses to have fewer entities or to make it so their structure is less complicated. But I wouldn't let that be the driving reason. So I don't think it really changes your planning. It more just gives you this additional requirement that you do have to satisfy so you're not getting in trouble.
Gotcha. So I don't know much about this, but as we talk, I'm kind of curious. What happens if somebody has, entities offshore, right? Like offshore accounts, offshore entities. Does that still fall under FinCEN, or how would that work?
The law also requires that foreign entities be registered as well, if you're a U.S. citizen.
Gotcha. So if a foreign entity owns assets or does anything in the United States, that foreign entity has to disclose also who's controlling who owns it.
That's right.
Interesting. What else should I be asking? I think those are pretty straightforward, but what else should I be asking?
Well, one other thing that people don't know is that not only does the owner and the beneficial owner have to register, but the person who, if you're creating a new LLC, the person who actually set up the LLC has to also register. So the person who files the LLC documents with the state of Utah has to register, and if a lawyer is involved, the lawyer also has to register. Those are called the organizers. I think there's a different word, but it's like the organizers. The people who create the entity have to register.
So if anybody else drafts the documents other than you, they also have to register.
That's right.
What happens if they've got an older LLC? Maybe that person to help them draft isn't around anymore, or?
Well, this is only for new ones.
Okay.
The ones that were created before January 1st of 2024, you don't have to disclose who the organizers are, but the new ones you do.
So attorneys then that are involved in setting up different entities are going to be on a lot of different documents, I guess you could say.
They do. FinCEN allows the attorney and anyone else who wants to get what's called a FinCEN ID number. I have one. And once you have that, you just have to provide that number. You don't have to resubmit all your information every time.
So you just say, hey, this number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 was involved in creating this LLC, and that's all you have to.
Your name and your number, yeah.
And then if you're an attorney that does a lot of that work and you move, do you have to update on every single LLC that you've created?
You would, except if you have the FinCEN ID, you only have to update it in one place.
Just the ID, and then it flows through the rest of it.
That's right, and that's why it's a good idea to have an ID.
So is it only the organizers or the people who draft that get a FinCEN ID, or do you get an ID when you register for all your entities, and you could do the same thing?
You could do the same thing. Like
Okay.
if I owned 5 entities that I'd created for myself, 5 LLCs, I could get a FinCEN ID and use that for all 5.
Interesting. So why do you feel that, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, I'm just curious, but why do you feel like people are irritated by this or feel like it's a violation of their, I guess you'd say their rights to an extent?
Well, I think there's 2 reasons. I think one is that they don't see any benefit to themselves. They just see this as another government imposition of something more they have to do. And the second is, I don't know anyone who is happy about having to put their driver's license or their passport into a government database. They're not happy about having that out there. And most people, once they realize this is a requirement, they go ahead and do it. But no one's pleased about having to provide that additional information to the government.
Right. Even though TSA's got it, like if you went through and listed, there was a document that I saw somewhere, because privacy isn't always an interesting thing, but the article was written about social security numbers. And the premise of the article was, if you actually understood everybody who had your social security number, you'd realize you really don't have privacy, right? Because the schools have got it if your kids are in school. The TSA's got it. The police department probably has it. Different departments of state and federal government, the IRS, everybody, this number actually is probably in, and the article I think stated over 20 different places on the average. But just the fact that you have to go and give it to someone else, I think, is the irritating part.
Yeah, we certainly don't have as much privacy as we think, but this just erodes it even a little bit more.
Anything else that people should be aware of or interesting things about it?
Well, you might need help if you have a very complicated structure. If you just have like a husband and a wife as owning an LLC, it's easy for them to do it themselves. But if you had a complicated structure where an LLC is owned by a corporation, which is owned by a couple of trusts and so on, or several different layers of entities owning other entities, you might need some help because you have to do some mathematics to calculate which of those are 25% owners. And so doing it yourself, you might be taking some unnecessary risks.
Interesting. So you brought up a good point that if you're less than 25% owner, do you have to register, or is it just people who own 25% or more?
Just 25% or more. So if you had an LLC with, say, 5 owners that each own 20%, none of them would have to register. The only person who would have to register would be the manager.
Interesting. So that might be something to, I guess, consider as well, right? If you have a family LLC that your kids are on or something like that, that might provide you a little bit of wiggle room, I guess you could say.